Hello and welcome to the Cyber Intelligence Briefing, the podcast designed to bring you the latest cybersecurity insights straight from our experts here at SRM. My name is Saad Nabil, and I'll be your host for this episode. And with me today, I have a very special guest. I would like to introduce Ailsa Wood. Now, Ailsa is a seasoned forensic investigator here on the SRM Incident Response Team. Welcome to the podcast, Ailsa.
Hello, Saad. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so Ailsa, let's get right into it. Ailsa, we worked on a very fascinating case a few weeks ago dealing with a cyber attack from the Lorenz ransomware gang. Now, here at SRM, we're no stranger to ransomware incidents. That's sort of our bread and butter, so to speak. But can you let us know, can you let our audience know some of the things that stuck out about this case?
Yeah, sure. It was, like you say, a really interesting case for us both to work on. And again, as you say, SRM, we've obviously worked our fair share of ransomware responses. Plenty of them have also been, perpetrated by the Lorenz group, so they're no stranger to us. Few of the things on this case really did stand out for us, but most of all, it was actually the age of the initial attack vector. The ransomware attack itself covered a span of only about 2 days, but the initial access vector actually happened quite significantly before that. So I guess kind of with any ransomware case, as you'll know, one of the first things that we consider when we're trying to identify that root cause of the incident, how they got in the first place, is we look into that ransomware threat actor's TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So, for example, does the group have a history of using a certain phishing campaign? Do they target vulnerable exchange servers or certain firewall appliances? Now, Lorenz in particular, we've recently seen them to use vulnerabilities in internet-facing Mitel telephony appliances. So that's where we started our hunt. And then just a little bit of background here. Mitel telephony is a communication system that allows people to make sort of audio, video calls, send messages, and so on, using the internet rather than using traditional sort of phone lines. That underlying protocol is something called voice over IP, or VoIP for short. And VoIP systems are, pretty commonplace, particularly in offices with sort of a phone per desk in that traditional sort of setup. And there are other vendors as well. But Mitel itself is a reasonably large, reasonably well-known vendor for this. And then, as with any other digital product or appliance, particularly those that require that direct access from the internet, Mitel products can be targeted by either bug bounty hunters or malicious threat actors, trying to find vulnerabilities to exploit them or responsibly disclose them back to the vendor for reward as well. But unfortunately for our client in this case, it was actually a malicious actor that found the vulnerability and then exploited it as well.
Also, thanks for that explanation. That's quite a lot going on, of course, in that case, as I recall. Now, just a question regarding the tactics, techniques, and procedures. So do these TTPs always match up when we're looking at ransomware gangs and checking what sort of techniques that they use?
Yeah, of course. It's not always that kind of one-to-one mapping. We wish it were so simple. But in this case in particular, there was another pretty significant pointer as well, in that the binary, the ransomware binary itself, was actually named VoIP.exe. And as I say, that voice over IP sort of system as they're written, it married it up a little bit too cleanly for us to ignore.
Okay, also, just to sort of go back into something you said earlier, there was quite a gap between initial access and the actual exploitation and impact of the ransomware from this gang. So can you tell us a little bit about how that is?
Yeah, of course. And actually, interestingly, the Mitel vulnerability that was exploited in this case was actually patched by the company's MSP, their managed service provider, only a few days or so after the patch was published, after the vulnerability had been identified. And that naturally made it even harder for us to find. Now, unfortunately for the client, the threat actor had already exploited the vulnerability and actually placed the web shell on this internet-facing Mitel system. It was a Linux-based system sitting on their network perimeter. But when the MSP actually applied the patch, the vulnerable software in that vulnerability, that was removed from the system, which meant that no one could further exploit it. However, patching isn't necessarily designed to identify if it's already been exploited. So in this case, the web shell persisted and left an open backdoor into the network ready for somebody else to attack. The web shell itself, it actually lay dormant on this system, specifically waiting for a specially crafted web request to arrive and allow someone else to enter the network. The shell was actually sitting there for 5 whole months before it was used by the Lorenz group to perform their ransomware attack. And as I sort of mentioned before, the ransomware attack itself took around 48 hours from access through to detonation. So that 5 months of waiting just to get that going really stood out to us.
All right, so there's quite a lot to unpack here. Given how old the web shell is and the fact that there was a 5-month delay in accessing it, I mean, does this indicate that Lorenz was just sitting on this for months, or how do you see that?
Yeah, it's definitely possible they were just sitting on it. Although I'd argue it's also possible there's some type of initial access broker that's been sort of used in the interim.
Okay, so that is a really interesting observation. So can you tell us a little bit about what an initial access broker is?
Yeah, of course. Initial access brokerage is a type of malicious activity that involves a threat actor finding a way into an environment, whether it's through a phishing campaign or stealing credentials in some way, or finding a vulnerability and then installing a backdoor, or otherwise, there's plenty of ways to do it. And rather than using that access themselves for further nefarious activity, they actually sell that access on to somebody else, to someone that's going to pay them for that access. And so it's possible that there is an expert in Mitel out there somewhere, or even sort of VoIP systems in general, that identified the vulnerability, created an exploit, and then ran that en masse across any machine that they could find on the internet that was vulnerable to that vulnerability. In this sense, we kind of refer to this as casting a wide net for their potential future victims rather than really targeting somebody that they're going for. The really long wait time in this attack between that initial compromise of the Mitel system on this client's perimeter and then the ransomware event, that whole 5 months, it really does align with the theory that it's this initial access brokerage type system, and that the wide net found a lot of future victims or future potential victims. And then they were working their way through their list of victims and selling on that access to various ransomware groups. One thing also to bear in mind as well is it's also possible that this expert in telephony exploitation is employed solely by the Lorenz group, or that Lorenz actually have Mitel experts sitting in a specific branch of their criminal organization. We just can't say for sure either way.
No, that's extremely interesting just because, I mean, it really shows the sophistication and dedication of criminal groups to very specific technologies, right? No, so thank you for elaborating on that. The one thing that really stuck out to me on this case was the point of entry that you found. So, as we mentioned before, in terms of niche, this quite fits the bill. A ransomware gang with specialized knowledge in exploiting telephony systems, right? Could you elaborate on what the point of entry was and how it went undetected?
Yeah, of course. So the vulnerability in question, and sort of for the record, this is in the CVE database released in 2022. It is a critical vulnerability that allowed remote code execution on Mitel systems due to improper input validation. So to kind of put that more simply, this effectively means that a threat actor can run arbitrary code on a Mitel box by specially crafting web requests to it. In our case, they actually use the vulnerability to call back to their own infrastructure and download a malicious web shell from there. Now, at the time, this vulnerability was really newly identified. So these sort of crafted requests to exploit it, they were not likely to be caught by any kind of automated detection at sort of firewall level. And it was just too new. The security vendors, such as firewall detection rules and antivirus and so on, they just hadn't caught up with the type of identification needed for this brand new exploitation. alongside that, the shell itself, it was only a single line of PHP code. It was crafted so that it would wait for an HTTP post request to send a unique identifier, kind of like a password, so that nobody else could access it, and alongside some more code for this web shell to run. So in itself, the shell didn't actually have specific malicious functionality beyond listening for kind of further instruction sent to it. With so little content, it was literally just the one line. It would have been really difficult for an antivirus software to have actually found it. So we only managed to identify this shell through forensic analysis of that Linux system that I mentioned sitting on the perimeter, which actually revealed to us how it had been created, even though that vulnerable software that had been exploited had been removed when the patch was applied by the MSP. We even actually found remnants on disk of the full HTTP packets that had been sent to the web shell that showed us commands that had been run by the Lorenz group against this system when they got access to that malicious shell. The commands included instructions to download, extract, and then execute Chisel, which is a secure tunneling tool, which granted them secure access to the system, as in through an encrypted kind of channel, which allowed them to hide any further commands that they were sending. So no security tool really stood a chance to identify what was going on there.
That is a really cool finding, Ilse. I mean, I think in terms of operational security, this is one of the gangs that sticks out to me because, I mean, when you break in and you have sort of the keys to the kingdom, sort of going the extra mile, right, to do all of this to cover up your tracks is quite an effort. At least from my perspective. Now, before we go, I want to sort of touch upon that as well in terms of defense evasion. Can you tell us how the attacker covered up their tracks, specifically on also the Linux system that's used for telephony?
Yeah, absolutely. I found this a really interesting point from a forensic perspective as well. So there are some sort of key Linux forensic artifacts that investigators like you or I would use to track malicious activities on systems, across networks, and so on. And on Linux systems, we tend to focus a lot on, there's a lot of log data available, sort of audit data, access logs, secure logs, and so on. Now, in this case, the threat actor not only cleared up their historical content, so we couldn't take that look back that we normally would, but they actually completely replaced the logs with something called a symbolic link to a specific file that exists on Linux systems, the file path dev null. This basically means that any additional log entries that would have been generated by any further malicious activity on the system would actually have just been sent straight into oblivion rather than being written to the log files at all. Now, normally, as forensic investigators, when threat actors clean up after themselves, we can see the time of their last activity on that system. We sometimes refer to it as the exit time. Because usually when a threat actor is cleaning up after themselves, it's the last thing that they do. They want to make sure they've covered up as much activity as possible. In this case, instead of doing that at the very end of their activities, all we could say is that they'd performed this cleanup and anti-forensic technique at some point, any unknown point during their hands-on activity on that system. And then, of course, as well, I'm sure you'll also recall how the ransomware executable itself was actually brought into the network.
Yeah, that was one of the most memorable techniques that we discovered in this case. I recall Lorenz bringing in their malicious payload via a JPEG image, like titled with the client name, and then using command line arguments to convert it back into a binary executable, avoiding AV detection. And that really stood out for me because it gave me the impression that Lorenz, but also their affiliates, are extremely methodical in what they do, especially with this level of sophistication.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually the range of anti-forensic techniques that we saw in this attack in particular, which demonstrates that really high level of sophistication. They've clearly considered how best to avoid being caught and being stopped in their tracks, acting as stealthily as they possibly can. And even the speed with which they moved laterally across the network, they exfiltrated data, and even up to and including the detonation of ransomware, And that 48-hour turnaround really does indicate a good understanding of the technologies at play in the network, and a pretty experienced hand sitting there behind the keyboard.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Lorenz coming up in more cases in the future, because this was, I mean, as bad as it is for clients to be infiltrated and taken down, from a forensic standpoint, it was just super fascinating to get an insight into the techniques that they use. Ailsa, it was honestly a pleasure to have you on this podcast. So thank you so much. I'm very excited for our next case together.
As am I. Thank you so much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure.
Again, thank you so much, Ailsa, and a big thank you to our listeners as well. And we really hope that you reach out to us with any feedback or any questions. We'll be happy to go over that and hopefully shed some light on new findings in future episodes. So please, catch us next time.